So, thank you everybody. This is the last session in what I think has already been an absolutely fascinating morning. Real richness of kind of detail and specifics, as well as coming out to some of the broader policy lessons. As Bruce mentioned, this now is the only thing that remains standing between you and the sandwiches, which I imagine are being laid out in the foyer at this very moment. So that is an incentive for everyone to stay and really focus on this last session, and also, of course, an incentive for us to keep it short. My name is Claire Melamed, and I'm the director of the Poverty and Inequality Programme here at ODI. It's great pleasure to be chairing this final session. Now, I know Bruce and Rolf have both spoken earlier, so I imagine you've been introduced to both of them already, so we will skip that bit. But I think just a few words to introduce this session. In my mind, this is the so what session of the day. This is the point where we start to think to really try to think more broadly than the specific case studies and stories that we've been hearing about, and think about what this means for other countries, for employment policy in general, for the decisions, the policies, the resource allocation of all of the different actors that are involved, which, as we've been hearing, is an exceptionally complicated story. Just a very few brief remarks from me to start. First of all, I think, job creation, employment policy is possibly one of, if not the most politically important area of policy that governments face. Obviously, the ability of governments to preside over economies in which there is employment that is appropriate and available to all is one of the key kind of political challenges that governments face. When they fail on that, they're likely to fail in general, to be exceptionally unpopular and not to survive very long. One of the things that we do here at ODI is we work with the UN Development Programme on something called the My World Survey, which is a very basic opinion survey, global opinion survey. So far had 7 million responses to date, which we think makes it the largest ever opinion survey. And consistently, is almost no way of breaking down the data that we're collecting between genders, between countries, between levels of income, which doesn't place the desire for a job in one of the top 3 aspirations that people have for themselves and their families. This is obviously, speaks to the political importance of jobs, but it also speaks to the challenges for governments. The other 2 that consistently rank in the top 3 are health and education. Now, for health and education, obviously, we look to governments as providers of those things in many cases. Jobs, we look to governments to somehow facilitate the creation of jobs, but not actually to necessarily provide them themselves, notwithstanding the very high rate of public sector employment in Vietnam. It's still a tiny minority. So the role of governments here and those other actors who are trying to kind of deliberately shape employment opportunities and patterns is to predict what might happen in the future. As we heard from Claudia, they're constantly trying to sort of second guess trends, market trends, technological trends and so on, and predict what might happen in the future, react to shifts in market opportunities, shifts in trading patterns and so on, and also, of course, try to influence private sector behaviour and the outcomes in relation to the outcomes in terms of the employment prospects and opportunities for different groups. They're trying to do this by shaping both the demand side, shaping private sector decisions through various instruments, and the supply side through education policy and other areas of government policy, trying to shape what it is that, in a sense, the private sector can be drawing on in terms of education. There are a number of different ways they do this, generally to try to sort of open up opportunities and make things easier for the private sector in very broad ways, and also to try to shift the distribution of both the supply and the demand of jobs in favour of specific regions, specific demographic groups, specific sectors, and so on. We've heard already today this is phenomenally complicated It's complicated both in terms of the number of actors that are involved, the levels of uncertainty we're dealing with. We've heard several times already this morning about the very poor data in this section, in this area. For a lot of the time, we don't really know what's going on. There's also a huge uncertainty in terms of what the outcomes of any given policy might be. It's very hard, even for the government that has the best data and the best resources, to be absolutely certain that if you pull a policy lever here, something definite will come out the other end in terms of improved employment prospects for specific groups or productivity changes and so on. It's also, of course, intensely and completely political, in the sense that what we're talking about is resource allocation within countries, often, very large amounts of resources shifting about. These are possibly the most fiercely contested areas of policy, which makes, what can sometimes look like, we sometimes approach this as a very technical, macroeconomic, technical issue, but clearly, of course, it's also one of the most fiercely contested political issues. And I think somebody said in the last session, we have to keep the political economy right at the front of our minds in all of this. We've been hearing there's a number of different levers that governments have to pull to try to navigate their way through this phenomenally complicated area. We have questions around education policy, regulatory frameworks, different kinds of investment in infrastructure and other things that governments can do, and of course a whole series of incentives in the area of tax, subsidies, and other areas to try to sort of push and pull employment changes between regions, sectors and specific demographic groups. So given all of that complexity, which we've seen expressed at a very kind of interesting and enlightening granular level in the case studies that have been presented this morning, what we're trying to do in this last session is really come a step out of that, think, okay, what is it that this is telling us about how, are there any broader lessons here which can inform the decisions, the choices, the investments of different actors? It's not only governments, of course. We're also, there's a large group of institutions involved here. There are governments, there are the private sector, there are non-governmental organisations, educational institutions, and so on. We're talking to a very large group of institutions. But what can we pull out of this research that illuminates what can be done by other actors in the future to try to make these decisions, which are by their nature difficult, a little bit easier, or at least a little bit clearer in terms of what the options are for those governments and others that are currently grappling with that. I'm going to first ask Bruce, we've been working Bruce very hard this morning, but this is the last leg, to just sum up a little bit the lessons from this synthesis paper, which has really brought together the findings from the different country-level research that we've been doing in this project. I'm going to first ask Bruce to sum up some of the lessons from that, and then ask Rolf to react both to that and to some of the wider discussion that we've been having this morning. And then, of course, there'll be time for everybody else to pitch in as well. So over to you, Bruce.